Section 7 of The Princess Pourquoi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Teresa Walcott. The Princess Pourquoi by Margaret Pollock Sherwood. Section 7. The Seven Studious Sisters. Part 1. His Majesty the King was in a terrible state of mind. Leaning back, speechless, upon his throne, with his crown over one ear, his fists clenched, he strove in vain to speak, but only an inarticulate gurgling made its way from the royal throat. Behind him stood his jester, merry in cap and bells. On the right, the court philosophers, with puckered brows and sagely folded arms, and all about knights-at-arms and ladies-in-waiting, silent and dismayed. Before the king, on the lowest step of the throne, almost under the gold-brocaded canopy, knelt with clasped hands and beseeching eyes Sylvie, Natalie, Amelie, Virginie, Sidonie, Dorothy, and Clementine, the 7 beautiful daughters of old Count Benoit of Verdennes, all badly frightened, but intrepid. "Speak," thundered the king at last. "No, don't speak. Every word will be used against you." "Your Majesty," began Sylvie, who was the eldest and had black hair, "we came to beg—" "With great earnestness," continued Natalie, who had brown hair. "That you will give us the opportunity," said golden-haired Amelie, shivering. "To study," said Virginie, who had brown eyes. "And grow wise," said Sidonie, whose eyes were blue. "And so we ask," said Dorothy, who had gray eyes. "That we may enter the university," said little Clementine, who had dimples. It was sad for the youngest to say the hardest part of all. Yet perhaps it was only fair, as it was the strong will of Clementine that had led them there, and the courage of Clementine that had kept them from faltering by the way. They were simply repeating what they had just said. The parts had been arranged before coming, in hope that His Majesty could not resist. Never, in their worst forebodings, when they had talked it over as they braided one another's hair in the tiring room of the castle, had they dreamed of anything so terrible as this. "Well, what put this idea into your heads?" thundered His Majesty. Then the 7 answered as one maiden, "The Princess Pourquoi." The king groaned aloud, and the knights-at-arms and the ladies-in-waiting groaned with him. Was it not enough for him to have had a daughter whose useless thinking had embittered his reign? She, with her quick intellect and ready questions, had made his throne totter under him, and now, when she was safely married and away, and had made as good a match as the dullest maid in Christendom, must the spirit of inquiry come back to him in 7 shapes? Since she was gone, all had been peace. He had been able to sleep most of the other half of the day also. His Majesty fidgeted under his purple robe. The Church had taught him that it was right for the sins of the fathers to be visited upon the children, but nothing about the sins of the children being visited upon the fathers, and he could not understand. Sylvie, Natalie, Amelie, Virginie, Sidonie, Dorothy, and little Clementine looked at him with begging eyes. Now brown eyes and blue eyes and gray eyes and black hair and brown hair and golden hair and dimples all appealed strongly to the king, and he was surprised at himself for a moment for not being able to act as ugly as he thought he felt. "What do you want to study for?" he demanded, his hands slowly unclenching. "I don't know," faltered little Clementine, blushing into her dimples. Somewhere there was a faint ripple of laughter, and yet the jester's face was perfectly sober when he lifted his head. "To be wise and know things," said Sidonie. The king stomped. "To be a power," said Natalie. "Pshaw!" said the king. "To understand all things," said Virginie. The king groaned. "So that people will like us," said Amelie. Then came again that echo of mocking laughter, and the jester muttered from behind the throne, "Now, are there some here that are greater fools than I? For the whole world knows that a woman is better beloved for what she understands, not then for what she understands." The king looked desperately about him, for he was at his wits' end, but none came to his aid. The philosophers, with their eyes cast down, were stroking their beards. The ladies in waiting were looking away, as delicacy demanded, after so shocking a request. The knights-at-arms were frankly gazing at blue eyes or brown, as taste suggested. Then the king spoke hoarsely. "This is treason. The lowest dungeon in my castle is not too hard a punishment for such offence. At any cost, this spirit must be quenched at any cost." Tears flowed softly down the cheeks of the 7 maidens and fell on their clasped hands, and the drops from Virginie's brown eyes sparkled like jewels on Amelie's golden hair. Then, in the sorrowful pause, the king's jester stepped softly forward, and the little bells upon his patches rang as he came. "Sire," said he, "I could tell a remedy more potent than this and less savage." "Speak, fool," said the king. "Not of all folks," answered the jester with a smile. "They understand not your folly," said the king. "Aye, but they might, for none can tell the words of wisdom may begin to penetrate dull brains. Clear me the room of these philosophers and the others, and let the maidens be gone, for I cannot abide a woman's tears." "Go," said his majesty. Then the weeping maidens and the ladies in waiting passed out in a shimmer of gold color and crimson and blue and rich green, and after them, like a shadow, crept the philosophers in garments of black. And then, with a clash of steel and flashing of wrought armor, went the knights-at-arms, and the presence chamber was empty save for the king on the throne and the jester, who stood before him in the posture of the philosophers, with folded arms and head bent low. "Sire," said the fool, "when women grow wise—" "The kingdom is lost," said his majesty. "Little enough comfort is there now." "They will outstrip their brothers," said the jester. "They will meddle with matters of state," said the king. "They will see through us all," continued the fool. "For my part, I would keep them the sweet blind creatures that they are. 'Tis enough for me. I see through myself. Now there's one way, and one only, to check the growing intellect of women." "And what may that be?" asked the king, the sadness lifting from his face. "Forsooth, they must have a university of their own," answered the jester. "What?" thundered his majesty. "Ay," said the fool, nodding. "There is no other way. The Princess Pourquoi has lighted in this land a fire that can be put out in only one fashion. Let a foundation be made, let walls rise, let lecturers come. Naught save a university curriculum will avail now to dull the wits and divert the minds and check the thought of women." "In truth you have a pretty wit," said the king, and he smiled. "But who will take charge of this undertaking and plan me the work that it may avail?" "I," said the jester. "Who else? Cap and gown would become me well, and though the king may lose his fool, he will gain my lord rector, who will speak bravely in the Latin tongue." "And whom can we trust to aid in the work?" asked his majesty. "Lend me but the philosophers," said the jester with a wink, "and their natural parts shall prevail where intent might come badly off in this great task of dulling women's wits." When the two spoke long between themselves, and when they had finished, the jester went and called the pages, and the great doors were thrown open, so that all entered as they had gone, and there was a shimmer of silk and shining of jewels and gleaming of armor. The 7 maidens came trembling in every limb, not knowing but their heads should fall, and they knelt as before at the foot of the throne, only now they had nothing to say. Then the king lifted up his voice and, smiling, said that it should be even as they had desired, and that learning and wisdom should be theirs. In one thing only should change be made. They should not mingle with the herd of men, but should have, sequestered and apart, a place of learning for womankind. When they heard this, Sylvie leaned her face upon the head of Natalie and wept for joy. and Natalie hers upon the head of Amelie, and Amelie upon Virginie, and Virginie upon Sydney, and Sydney upon Dorothy, and Dorothy upon little Clementine, and because Clementine had nowhere to lean her head, she wept into her own dimples. Then the king's fool went away, and did not come again, and of this there was great talk for 3 days, and then all was forgotten, for another jester filled his place. One day appeared at court a grave gentleman, clad all in flowing black, bearded, and with eyes cast down in a sort of inward look. All called him my Lord Rector, and none knew him for the king's jester, because he had changed his cap. He spoke but little, and that in Latin, as verbum sat sapiente, depressus extolla, veni vidi, vici, and if he made jibe or jest, there were none who could understand. There was upon the outskirts of the city a great building that had once been the Palace of Justice, but was no longer used because a loftier one had been erected in the square where the minster rose. This stood not far from the river bank, and was all of grey stone that had crumbled somewhat, so that the tracery of leaf and flower in the Gothic windows and the faces and claws of the gargoyles that peered from roof and corner were in many places worn away. It was built on 3 sides of a great court, where now grass and vine and flower grew unchecked on the spot once worn by the feet of gathering citizens and the tramp of steeds. Bluebird and swallow and wren had entered through the broken windows, and had built about the window niches and in the crannies of the carven vine. This, said the king, should be the place of learning consecrated to the maidens, for it was not meet that they should gather in the market square or on the hill beyond the minster, as young men did in those days, when thousands came together to listen to philosophical disputes, and no roof was sufficient to cover them. Workmen came and mended broken arch and column, and cleared away the tangled vines of the court, but left growing grass and flower, and did not touch the nesting birds, for the 7 lovely sisters begged that they might stay. Hither flocked innumerable damsels, who came riding from all parts of the kingdom, with squires before them and waiting maids behind. They came on black jennet and white palfrey, and pony of dapple grey. Maiden madness had run throughout the kingdom, and all who could sit on saddle or hold rein rushed hither for their share of the new learning. Many were pursued by father or brother, by maiden aunt or widowed mother, begging them to abide at home in safety as modest maidens should. It was noised abroad that Lord Rector would deliver the first lecture when the new work began, and all were eager to hear. So it came to pass one day that a huge company passed in procession under the carven Gothic gate and into the great hall, where stained windows looked one way on the river and the other way on the court. First, in gown of velvet and of silk, came my Lord Rector, muttering in his beard. After him followed the philosophers, with stately step and slow, and then young squires a many, who were eager to see what would befall, and lords and ladies in gay clothing, rarely embroidered in choice colours. There were maiden students also, many score, and at their head Sylvie, in scarlet silken gown, and Natalie in green, Amelie in brown velvet, curiously slashed, and Virginie in yellow, Sydney in blue samite, and Dorothy in silver, and little Clementine in white, as befitted her tender years. Now behold, within the great hall the king was already waiting in a chair of state under a velvet canopy, and my Lord Rector and the philosophers of the new faculty bowed low to him as they entered. Then the rector mounted upon a platform, and bowing to the king with Rex Augustimus, he winked in his old fashion and fell coughing, and the king winked back, and then fell a sneezing to hide the smile that was his beard only half concealed. Verde illustrissimi, continued the rector, bowing again before his audience and speaking in a solemn voice, mutatis mutandis, resco referens, da locum melibus, du femina facte muman est era nil nisi cruce, graviora manent post nubila phoebus sunt lacrimae vi victus. The last words came with a quiver of the voice, and many wept, for they did not understand his folly. Then my Lord Rector turned to the fair body of women students and spoke, seeing only the face of little Clementine. Feminae proclaris mai, credo quia impossibile est inest Clementia forti crede quod abis et habeas sic itur and astra toga virila vita sin literis morst est varium et mutable semper feminina vad pas. And with this there was hardly a dry eye in the house. So the new university was opened. Needless to say, the success of the undertaking was great. Throughout the land, bower and hall and dell were left empty, for the maidens had all gone to the capital to get learning. They no longer wrought fair figures in the embroidery frames in the great halls of their ancestral castles, or polished the armor of father and brother, or brewed cordials for the sick over the glowing coals. They no longer wandered in gowns of green on their palfreys, by hill or dale for the joy of going. By hundreds they bowed their fair heads before the philosophers as they lectured, taking notes upon the tablets of their minds, for they did not know how to write. My Lord Rector, when he spoke, could find no room large enough to contain his audiences, so he lectured only on sunshiny days, and stood on a platform in the centre of the great court, and words of grave nonsense fell from his lips as the light fell on golden hair or brown. So intently did the maidens listen that they did not smell the fragrance of the flowers crushed beneath their feet, wild rose and lily and violet, nor did they hear the beat of the wings of startled birds, nor see red crest or golden wing or blue flash across the sky. Being a cunning man and keen, my Lord Rector had left to the flocking students the choice of the lectures that they should pursue. Let them but manage it themselves, he said, smiling wickedly at a private audience with the king, and we shall see great things. So the maidens met in assembly and consulted gravely together, and conferred with rector and with faculty, and presently many branches of learning were established, and all was going with great vigor. Each student chose for herself what course she should pursue, and it was pretty to see how maiden whims worked out into hard endeavor. Black-haired Sylvie specialized in dramatics, for she made, with her sweeping locks, an excellent tragedy queen. Natalie in athletics, she took the standing high jump better than any knight in Christendom. Golden-haired Amelie devoted all of her time to fiddling and gigology, and soon became proficient. Virginie of the brown eyes took ping-pong and fudge. Blue-eyed Sydney, acrostics and charades. Dorothy took chattering and cheering, and soon her sweet voice could be heard above the noise of building, or the roar of battle, while little Clementine worked at all branches of frivolity, and became a great favorite, for in looks and in manner and in taste she represented that which is most pleasing in woman. To tell of all they did and learned and thought would be too long a tale, and moreover the records of much of it have perished, but men say that their life was both strenuous and merry, and that womankind blossomed out into new beauty of face and form and mind. The infinite range of opportunity has been but faintly shadowed forth in the hints already given, and to those who philosophized and those who poetized, those who took societies and those who took cuts, life was one long burst of irrelevant, joyous activity. Most zealous of all the students was little Clementine. Ceaselessly alert, she listened with upturned face to lectures in the great flower-grown court. With infantile audacity she ventured out into vast unknown realms of thought, and puckered her white forehead in trying to work out the unutterable syllable. Now she walked the cloisters, where the shadow of carven leaf and tendril fell on her hair, studying a parchment, and again, in moments of relaxation, she rode her dog-eared pony fast and furiously, To some this animal may seem strange, but there were many queer creatures in those days, as Sir John Maundeville tells. It came to pass, no one knows how, that nothing done by little Clementine escaped the notice of my Lord Rector, for his eyes followed her always. When he lectured to Clementine, whether he said words of Latin or of the vulgar tongue, he spoke them to her eyes, and he was ashamed of the learned nonsense he was speaking when he gazed on Clementine. Sleeping, he saw her walking so and so under the shadow of Gothic arch with leaf shadows on her face, and he dreamed of taking the parchment from her white fingers, but here he always woke, though he tried to dream further. Clearly, something had happened to him that neither his experience as Sir Full nor as Lord Rector had prepared him to understand. Save for this haunting thought, he was very gay behind a solemn face. Dearly he loved his task, and none but the king and himself heard the faint tinkle of bells from under his scholar's cap. Always they greeted each other with Latin words, and they had many conferences wherein they chuckled together over the success of their plan, for they knew that they had drawn all these women forth to follow after the very shadow of learning, and that the end would leave them more ignorant than before. Always, however, in these moments of mirth, like a stab at the heart, came to the Lord Rector the thought of deception practised upon Clementine. Her trusting eyes, lifted to him in uttermost faith, reproached him by night and by day. If by force he put his conscience from him, he was sure to see her face as she listened, hiding in the recesses of her heart the silly words he said. Once, as she went alone toward the lodgings, and he followed at a great distance, a footpad set upon her in a dark corner where a stone stairway gave shelter to thieves, and my Lord Rector, rushing forward, struck lustily about him right and left, and felled the knave, taking from him the lady's netted purse and giving it back to her. She said no word save one of thanks, but after, when her eyes were raised, he saw that a new light had been added to the old, and that little Clementine reverenced him not only as a learned man, but as a brave one too. End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Section 8 of The Princess Pourquoi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Teresa Walcott. The Princess Pourquoi by Margaret Pollock Sherwood. Section 8. The Seven Studious Sisters. Part 2. So weeks drifted by, and months, and then came a great event, for the maidens had determined to carry out a custom that belonged to that olden time and formed the final test of the scholar. All agreed that Clementine, brave, childish, perverse little Clementine, should initiate the new audacity. Therefore, one early morning, when the first rays of the sun were just peeping over the high stone city wall, she might have been observed stealing in academic garb of black over her white dress to the great oak, iron-studded door of the old Palace of Justice. Here, with a stone, she hammered a long parchment, and she established herself hard by so that all who saw her knew that she was there to defend, against all comers, the thesis she had nailed up. Now there were 8, and they ran as follows. 1. That the ineffable and the intangible are not the same. 2. That all that is not is, and all that seems to be is not. 3. That, but it would be foolish to transcribe all the theses that little Clementine defended, for no one would understand. Suffice it to say that they were subtle beyond the mind of man, and clothed in words drawn from the deep abyss of the inane, where unborn thought goes ever crying for birth. One by one her 6 sisters came against her, and argued, but to no avail, for little Clementine, no less skilful than David of yore, gathered together verb and adjective and slung them so unerringly that antagonist after antagonist went down, and she, often snubbed as being but the youngest, stood forth in the eyes of the admiring crowd a victor. The picture that she made, standing against that grey stone wall, flecked with green moss, with a greening gargoyle leaning down toward her, was very sweet. In little Clementine, the brown hair and the golden hair, the brown eyes and the grey eyes of the family met in a peculiarly bewitching combination that had a chameleon quality of colour constantly changing. Moreover, as she argued in well-chosen words, she was unconsciously establishing the unspoken thesis that 4 dimples may exist at the same time in a maiden's face without seeming too many. This my Lord Rector saw, and something gave way within him. When the argument was over, and the audience was departing, he called Clementine to him inside the gate, as one who would ask something, and then stood speechless. The maiden, who was flushed and weary, lifted her scholar's cap, and he saw in the locks of hair that were neither brown nor gold, pearls woven, and above the collar of the gown showed the embroidered white samite of her dress. "Little Clementine," said my Lord Rector, "your student life is almost done. Does the fact cause rejoicing?" "Nay," said Clementine, casting down her eyes. "Shall you grieve for anything left behind?" "Ay," said the maiden. "And what?" asked my Lord Rector. "The learned lectures, the dissertations, the wise words," said Clementine, looking up and dimpling. "And any special ones?" asked he, wondering if she heard about him the jingle of bells. "Ay," said Clementine, smoothing her gown with slim white fingers and setting her lips together. Not another word would she say, though the great man begged humbly. "Clementine," asked my Lord Rector, changing the subject, "shall you ever wed?" "If the right man comes," said the maiden. "And what must he be?" "He must be very wise." "Am I wise, little one?" asked the rector. "Wisest of all," answered the maiden, whispering. Then he took her white hand in his and said softly, "Amo amas?" But Clementine did not understand a word of Latin. Looking up, however, she saw something she did understand, and then my Lord Rector bent and kissed her hand, wisely using the old way of wooing that was found before words, Latin or other, were invented. Then Clementine drew back trembling and looked, and behold, he who had been but a wonderful voice was changed, and she saw that he was a man, and young and comely, with merry eyes touched with sadness, and a mouth whose curves were both cynical and sweet. "Why should you choose me?" asked the maiden in a voice that shook for reverence. "Because you are so adorably foolish," cried the lover, forgetting, and that was a mistaken speech which mere words could not explain away. It was agreed between them that none should know what had befallen until the day when old Count Benoit and his lady Muriel came up to the city to take home their 7 daughters, for their work was counted done. So the 2 lived a glad life, though they spoke but seldom. Often a glance of the eyes made food for both day and night. All the time my Lord Rector's conscience pricked him more and more, until he could no longer bear it, and one day, coming upon Clementine where she passed the path by the rippling river, near 3 willow trees that were freshly leaved out, for it was spring, he told her the tale of how he and the king had deceived womankind, and, with torture of spirit, confessed himself the king's fool. Then Clementine looked up at him with eyes where the gray and the brown seemed flecked with green, perchance from the shadow of the willows, and said firmly, "I have always seen that they who call themselves fools are the least so." Nor could he ever after by any words of confession shake her steadfast faith in his wisdom. At last came the day when Count Benoit arrived, and with him cousins and other kin from far and near, for all would know something of the strange new ways of the city. At lecture hour all crowded together in the great hall, and again the king was there upon the dais, solemn of look, but merry of heart, for his eyes twinkled under his heavy eyebrows as he looked at the fair, fresh faces before him, innocent of thought as any other maiden's faces, and he chuckled to think how he and his dear fool had outwitted them all. Then he looked with affection at his trusty philosophers, who stood near in silk robes with slashes of velvet and hoods of rainbow colors, and he thanked heaven that had given him strong supporters in the crisis that had threatened his kingdom. Gazing upon the assembled audience of friends and kinsfolk, he rejoiced to think that for them, as for him, the country had been saved. But my Lord Rector was speaking in the Latin tongue. Ad hoc gradum admitto, and Sylvie, Natalie, Emily, Virginie, Sidney, Dorothy, and little Clementine, with all the other maidens who had frolicked with them merrily so long a time, arose, as pretty a sight to see as ever king in Christendom had before him, and their new honours fell upon untroubled white foreheads. With eyes cast down she followed him, and now she was rosy and now pale, and so the two kneeled at the foot of the king under the canopy. "We, too, do crave your Majesty's blessing," said my Lord Rector, "on our betrothal." Then a ripple of wonder and laughter ran through the great hall, and his Majesty, smiling, blessed them with extended hands, and as they rose he bent forward with a twinkle, whispering, "You have done well, my Lord Rector, in carrying out your purpose. It is pity that you may not marry them all." For the first time he found no answering jest in his favourite's eyes, and he would have inquired why, but the philosopher who stood nearest, and had caught the whisper, smiled, and taking Sylvie's hand, led her to the foot of the throne, saying, "But I, your Majesty, may wed this lady with the king's consent, for she has given hers." Then a second philosopher led forth Natalie, and a third Amelie, and a fourth Virginie, and a fifth Sidney, and a sixth Dorothy, and behold, the seven sisters were again kneeling before their throne, awaiting the king's blessing, but with their lovers at their sides. Then his Majesty leaned back his head and roared with laughter, till the vaulted ceiling re-echoed, and tears of mirth ran down his cheeks and shone upon his beard, and all laughed with him, though they knew not why, all save my Lord Rector, whose face wore the saddest look a man may wear. "Now, was this planned among you?" asked his Majesty. Then they shook their heads, and each philosopher said, "Forsooth, I thought I was the only one," and with that the king roared again. In the bustle that followed, when old Count Benoit and his lady Muriel hung upon the necks of their 7 daughters in turn, the king tapped the Lord Rector upon the arm. "You have builded even better than the promise said," whispered his Majesty. "From this blow shall the aggressive intellect of woman not rise." But the rector looked gloomily upon him and knelt again and begged that his Majesty would release him from further service, that he might go to the wars. "2 parts of the fool have I played for your Majesty," said the man bitterly, "and from both I would be released, for you and I have done a great wrong." Little Clementine had drawn nearer, and many-colored light purple and crimson and gold fell on her fair face and parted lips as she looked in wonder at her lover. Then the king saw and understood, and he was ashamed. "Nay, my Lord Rector," he said, bending low, "what we have done of wrong we will right. You shall even go on with the task set before you, and that you do lack of a wise man shall this woman's faith make good." End of chapter 4. Recording by Teresa Walcott.
Section 9 of The Princess Pourquoi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Deutschler. The Princess Pourquoi by Margaret Pollock Sherwood. Section 9, The Gentle Robber, Part 1. Once there was a robber bold, Not that he looked bold, for he had the gentlest of manners and the most persuasive tongue. It was with a many manly shyness that he approached his victims, and his voice was very low and soft as he convinced them how greatly to their interest it would be to hand over their purses, so that many went on through the green forest paths with empty pockets, it is true, but with eyes full of tears of gratitude for the benefactor who had held them up. "Pray don't mention it," said the robber chief, as he deprecatingly thrust into his wallet the purses he had taken and heard the outpoured thanks. "It is nothing, nothing. You would have done as much for me at any time if you had—" He never finished his sentence, but the wistful admiration of the man with empty pockets always added the right clause, "if you had had the brains." Now the gentle robber, it need hardly be said, was highly successful in his chosen calling, or, as he put it, the holy saints had given him rich possessions. He had started out moderately in a remote corner of the forest, as became a young and unassuming retail cut-purse, but soon his domain extended from his own retired dell to the adjacent glade, and the merry outlaw who had prospered there gave up the business and became a scrivener's clerk. It was not long before the robber chief owned the whole forest. The title deeds, to be sure, belonged to the abbey, which lay in a fat green meadow at the edge of the wood. But the monks could not work the forest as the robber could, and whatever harvest of gold and of silver, of jewels, of rich cloths from the packs of merchants of the East was to be gathered there, this one man reaped in his own apologetic way, which always seemed to beg pardon of those who were despoiled for doing them so much good at one time. Soon the country round the forest was his, and yokel, franklin, and squire, Sir Bertram from the castle, and the prior from the abbey, began to render him accounts, and it came to pass that the bishop at the capital city, Merton, and the king upon his throne, and the strong nobles about him trembled at the robber's name, for the waves of his power flowed out until they met the waves of the sea. Dearly the gentle robber loved his work in all its aspects, and he was master of its least details. A brave fight with a sturdy yeoman going home from market with a half-year's gains was joy to him, and merry in his ears was the sound of the thwack, thwack, thwack of the oaken staves as they fell on head and shoulders. An encounter with a rich merchant's train brought him naught but exhilaration, and the deft, swift hand that emptied the pack and purse thrilled as it went about its chosen task. There was slow, sensuous pleasure in stripping off the garments of knight and of squire, and leaving their limbs uncovered to the cold. Daintiest amusement of all was the spoiling of widow and of orphan. Something of the ascetic lingered in the bosom of the robber chief, and rare and delicate was the task of emptying the scantily furnished larder, of carrying away the worn clothes, and the single jewel saved from the wreck of happier days. He found delight in feeling about his knees the clasp of the thin arms of the naked orphan as it wept for food, for genius knows no distinction of small and great, and yeoman and squire, knight and merchant, widow and orphan alike, thrilled him with a sense of his power, and through their cries sang in his ear the word success. In the course of time it came to pass that he became the chief support of the kingdom, which he had caused to totter as he swept its riches into his own bulging pockets. When he came to court, as he sometimes did, wearing grave apparel and showing a modest face, the king leaned lovingly upon him. Was he not financing the war with Benemer and causing a half-dozen universities, which had but lately come into fashion, to rise in different parts of the land? The bishop conferred weightily with him in quiet corners. Was he not building the great cathedral which was to be the glory of the city throughout coming ages? "Nay, nay, nay," said the bishop, waving a white, jeweled hand as the chief began to divulge some of his larger plans. "Tell me not of thy wicked schemes. Thy methods I must condemn utterly, but if thou bringest me the money, well, I can at least see to it that it be not used for bad purposes. And, speaking of money, we need for the walls of the apse 100 bags of gold. Dost thou think thou could manage it?" "Ay," said the gentle robber, and that night he despoiled 9 men, killing 3 that resisted longest, for he was a great lover of Holy Church, and a devout believer, nor could she ask of him any service that he would not perform. Now the lust for gold is a strange thing. There be that gather it together into stockings and go hungry and dirty to the day's end for gold, and that is the miser's lust. There be that win it, and spend it again freely for delicate food and fiery drink, and this is the sensualist's lust. There be that get it by cruel means, and scatter it abroad on church and hospital, and this is the philanthropist's lust, which possessed the robber chief. Gold and jewels were piled so high in his forest cave that he could not see out of its window, and he hardly knew whether winter snow or the shadow of flickering leaves lay on the ground, nor could hungry church nor greedy halls of learning lessen his piles of treasure enough to let the sunlight in. Far on the edge of the kingdom to eastward lived blunt Sir Guy of Lamont, and his son and heir was a young squire, Louis by name, who had grown up much alone, wandering in the greenwood that circled the castle. Strong of arm and lusty he grew, yet cared not for the hunt, for he was friend to fox and hare, and the wild deer knew and loved him. Living close to spreading oak and delicate beech, among green leaves and nesting things, he began to wear the look of those who see more than meets the eye, and Knight and Franklin chaffed him as he sat apart while they grew merry over mug of ale or glass of wine in his father's hall. As he dreamed his dreams and thought his thoughts, rumors of the deeds of the robber chief floated to his ears, and he was sorely puzzled. It was a wandering merchant who brought the tale, spreading out his stuffs of velvet and of silk over table and settle and chair, and showing 3 great fresh sword cuts on his arm as he spoke. "Andrew, my brother, lost his head in the encounter, and it was severed by a single blow, but I escaped, though there be few that may." With that he recounted all the tales that he had heard in his wanderings of the wrongdoing of this man, and they were many. Sir Guy listened with "Zounds!" and "'Sdeath!" but the youth said never a word of pity or of blame. Yet, when the storyteller had finished, he marveled at the lad's eyes. They were gray eyes, with lashes dark and long, and the look in them was as the look in the eyes of a gentle beast when he is hurt to the death. Then came to them the sudden fire of the avenger of misdeeds. "My hour has come to fight," said young Louis of Lamont to the great stag that licked his hand that evening in the forest as the sun went down in golden haze. "Men do not know this cruel wrong. I must go to tell them, and mayhap lead them forth with banner and with sword." Early the next morning, when all were making merry at the hunt, he set the face of his snow-white steed to westward, and rode down the long, green, leafy ways and across a great level plain toward the setting of the sun. In doublet and hose of scarlet, laced with gold thread, he was comely to see, with a white plume in his velvet cap and thick hair of yellow clipped evenly at his neck, and on his face the beauty that shines out from a light within. All day he journeyed on, yearning to meet alone the robber chief, whom he pictured as a man brawny of arm and of evil countenance, wherein black brows hid the sinister eyes, and a black beard covered a cruel mouth. And the lad longed with the lusty strength of untried youth to measure swords with this terrible foe. That night a woman gave him shelter at a wayside hut, and told a tale of the chief that chilled the young man's blood. The next night, as he lodged at a hall, deeds yet more cruel were recounted to him, and ever as he came nearer the heart of the kingdom, he found the air more rife with tidings of the robber chief's ill doings. "They do not know," he said, lightly touching spur to his steed. "The king and the bishop do not know of these wicked things. Pray God that I may come in time to lead men forth." At the edge of a great forest he met one day a tired-looking man on a tired horse. The rider was neatly clad in sober gray, and was both freshly shaven and neatly combed. Across his saddle lay a great bag of something that was wondrous heavy. "Halt," said the man, with a pleasant glance from his mild blue eyes. Then blood rose red to the young squire's cheek, and anger too great for any words lighted in his eyes, as his hand went to his dagger, and he urged his horse forward. It was a brave fight that he made, while the two steeds drew near and parted and drew near again, but a slender white hand with an iron grip reached deftly and snatched the dagger from his hand, nor could he reach the short sword which he had so proudly belted to his side, and the strength of his adversary was the strength of 10. "Nay, be not foolish," said a soft voice, as the lad struck out with stinging fist. "'Tis but thy purse I ask, and it would grieve me to do thee wrong. The purses of the kingdom belong to me." "Now, by what right?" cried Louis of Lamont, between set teeth, his cheeks flaming deeper red. "By the right of having wit enough to get them," answered the robber. Then he pinioned the lad's arm to his side and thrust a deft hand into his pocket, drawing out a purse of wrought gold. "It will be to thy best advantage if thou canst but see it that way," he said courteously. In the mind of the other the vision of dark, beetling brows and red, hairy cheeks was fading. Thou art the robber chief," he stammered. His adversary bowed. "It is thou who didst murder Baron Divan, and who didst starve the squire's daughter of Yverdon with her 7 children, and—" So great was his horror of the tales that flocked to his tongue that he failed to speak them, but a light as from the wings of the angel of judgment shone from his eyes and brow. "The question is not, 'Shall I take thy purse?'" the chief said gently. "I have it. The question is, how shall I dispose of it to the best advantage?" "It isn't that. I do not want the purse," said the young man scornfully. "But how canst thou traffic in crime?" "I have little time for talking," said the gentle robber, with a hurt look on his face. He was extremely sensitive to adverse criticism. "Now I must be off. This great bag of gold is for the orphan hospital at the Abbey. If I may mention it without boasting, it derives most of its supplies from me." And he looked wistfully for approval. "Its supplies of orphans?" demanded Louis of Lamont, with his stern young lip curved in scorn. But the face of the other was as the face of a man who has failed to teach a great lesson of good. As the lad rode on through the forest, his head was bent as if a hand had struck it and had laid it low, but coming into the open, he saw far off across the valley the spires of the capital city, Merton, and its many red roofs gleaming by the blue river, and his heart throbbed within him for thankfulness and joy. "Hasten," he cried to the beast that bore him. "Yonder in that strong city be strong men to help me right ill deeds, and a minute gained may save some woman's life or spare the bitter crying of a child." His eyes were filled with a vision of the knights that would go out with him to war for the night, with the wavering of plumes and the flaming of banners, in their hearts the anger of God for cruel wrong, and a yearning for coming combat tugged at the muscles of shoulder and of arm. End of Part 1. Section 10 of The Princess Pourquoi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Deutschler. The Princess Pourquoi by Margaret Pollock Sherwood. Section 10. The Gentle Robber, Part 2. The palace of the bishop was moated, and there was a drawbridge there, and within, as on a green island, rose walls of fine grey stone, with window arch and doorway delicately carved. There was one at hand who took his steed, and one who led the way for him, and anon he found himself in a sunlit chamber where the bishop stood looking out upon the great cathedral which was rising stone by stone, with its blue-clad workmen standing against a bluer sky. "What is it, my son?" asked the bishop, when he saw a young squire standing before him, worn, dust-stained, with anger burning in his eyes. "Sire," said the guest, bending low, "I have hasted thither to tell thee of great wrongs." "They shall be redressed," said the bishop, laying his hand upon the lad's head. "There is a man," said Louis of Lamont, kneeling, his lips white with wrath, "who doth cruel wrong and bringeth folk to death, and it must needs be that none in high places know, for he goeth unpunished." "He shall be found and placed in my lowest dungeon," said the bishop fiercely. "Now tell me what he hath done." "On my way hither I lodged with a poor woman who told me that he had slain before her eyes her husband and her sons, and all for a cup of silver coin that stood upon the mantel." "A mere cup of silver coin," groaned the bishop. "He shall hang." Then he told of the murder of Baron Divon, and of the squire's daughter of Yverdon, who was starved with her 7 children, and he told all the tales that the wandering merchant had brought with his cloths of cashmere and of silk. As he spoke longer, the face of his host grew anxious, and when he finished saying, "Men call him the gentle robber," black care sat upon the brow of the host. "Delay not," pleaded Louis. "Give me armed men, for thou hast said that he shall die for his sins, and I have the blood of fighters in my veins." "Nay, child," said the bishop, "not so." "Thou hast promised!" he cried in amaze. "Ay," he made answer, "but I knew not then that the offences were so many and so great, or that the enterprise was planned upon so large a scale. That makes all different." "That makes the need to punish him 1,000-fold greater," stammered the lad. "Tut, tut," said the bishop, with the solemn smile he wore. "Thou dost not understand. Logic is ever lacking in the young. Should not stripes be laid upon him for each cry he hath drawn forth? Should he not lay down his life, if that were possible, for each life he hath taken? I had thought, when I heard the first tale that he should die for the single crime," the bishop made answer. "But the case is altered by the later facts. A life for a life, saith the Scripture, but not of a life for a dozen or 60 or 100, as the case may be." Then a flame of anger shone out in the lad's face, and he waited. "My son," said the bishop tenderly, "thou art young and ignorant, yet I will try to teach thee something of right ways of thought. In judging, all depends upon the point of view, and matters that look often black at first statement grow white or gray when thoroughly understood. Let us look upon this question in another aspect. Dost see yonder great cathedral rising?" Though the youth made no answer, the bishop saw that he was looking at the gray stones and at the blue-clad workmen. "'Tis God's house," said the bishop, "nor may it arise save through the gifts of this man. Wrong hath he done, but all is forgiven for that his gold is bent to holy purposes." "But wrong he doeth still," said Louis of Lamont in the stern voice of youth. The bishop coughed behind his hand even while he spoke. "There is much in the ways of Providence that we may not comprehend. God moveth in a mysterious way." "Had the robber chief ceased from his crime and shown true penitence," began the lad, but the bishop interrupted. "God hath need of the man and of all the gold that he will bring, that institutions of learning and holy places may arise in the land. God may be worshipped by wood and stream," said the youth in the still small voice of one who knew. "Nor hath he need of gold that is the price of suffering and pain and tears." And so he turned and went down the steps worn and weary, with dust on his crimson garments and shame on his spirit, and the light of his face grown dim. It had come back to its shining, however, the next day, when he went before the king. "It may well be that there is one bad man who hath power," he said to himself, "and he the bishop, but God would not grant that all be so," and hope beamed again from his eyes. "'Tis the son of my old friend Guy of Lamont, sayest thou?" cried the king, as he raised the lad's chin with one royal finger. "By my troth, 'tis his father's face again, but different." "Sire," said Louis, as he did reverence, "I have come to tell of cruel wrong, and to win from thee a promise of redress." "Thou shalt have it," cried the king, with his hand upon his sword. "Friend or child of my friend went never yet uncomforted from the foot of my throne. Speak thy wrong." Then the youth told him all that he had told the bishop, and added thereto other tales, and hope shone sternly in his eyes. "Send forth with me a band of thy men-at-arms," prayed the suppliant. "Even now, perchance, are orphans made that might have grown tall in happiness, save for this man's lust for gold." Then the king looked about, and his face grew dark with anger, for some half smiled and hid their smiles as best they could with jeweled hand or velvet sleeve. Some showed fear at seeing this thing, which was not breathed at court, boldly brought to light. "Boy," said the king sternly, "hast no respect for them that be appointed to sit in high places, nor awe before an anointed king?" "Yea, sire," answered Louis, marveling. "Dost come before my throne with slanderous tales of one on whom I lean heavily and lovingly?" "Sire," he said bravely, "thou dost not know his cruel deeds. He hath robbed and killed to the sickening of the heart." "Mayhap," said the king, "but he hath carried all before him with great success, and so is the case altered. 'Tis a man of whom we have great need, and the young should not speak ill of older folk." Then Louis of Lamont said never a word, but rose to his feet staggering, for the knowledge he had gained of men came as hard blows about the ears, and bending low, he turned away. "Stay!" cried the king. "Thy offence is great. Thou hast spoken ill of a public benefactor. Yet if thou wilt hold thy tongue, nor repeat thy silly tales, I will make thee one of my courtiers, and thou shalt go brave in velvet and in jewels." But the youth shook his head and went forth alone from the presence chamber. All looked after him with smiles and jeers, and whispered words of scorn. "'Sdeath!" cried the king, "'tis a madman fit for a dungeon, yet, for the sake of my old friend Guy of Lamont, can I not cast him there?" The lad groped his way unevenly down the marble steps of the palace as one gropes in a path that is full of pitfalls and has suddenly grown dark, and he wandered not knowing where through the dark streets, until he found himself in the square before the great cathedral. Here many were passing with hands full of flowers, red roses and tall white lilies, and blue blossoms that grow pale among the wheat, for it was the feast day of a saint, and they went to deck the altar which stood within unfinished walls, that men might worship there under the blue sky. "I will tell them," said the lad. So he stood upon the cathedral steps and repeated all the tale, and blossoms red and blossoms white were dropped at his feet, as men and women clustered about to hear. "Aye," they cried out, "we go hungry for this man, but who shall deliver us from him? Horses and armor could we find, perchance. Wilt lead us to him?" Then all of a sudden he smiled, and ceased speaking because of the choking in his throat. But after he took up the tale and told it in the marketplace, and before the palace of justice, and wherever he could gather folk together. As days passed, all this came to the ears of the king and of the bishop, and of the nobles of the court, and grave head met with grave head, and both were shaken solemnly in conference over this new peril which threatened the kingdom. One morn there went throughout the city a crier, who called aloud and read from a parchment in his hand to let men know that Louis of Lamont, son of Sir Guy, was cast out from Holy Church for slander of one of her greatest sons. Henceforward no man should give him shelter, no woman food or drink, lest they too come under the ban, and should he speak future evil words, his life would be forfeit. Yet one who loved him, and there were many, hid him, and the next day and the next he wandered in the streets, begging men to rise in vengeance against the robber chief. On the third day he was taken by armed men, and the decree went forth that Louis of Lamont should, after 3 days, be burned at the stake in the square of the Palace of Justice. The youth smiled when he heard his doom. Almost he was glad to escape from a world which he had not logic enough to understand. So the day came when he should die, and it was a Friday of midsummer. In the center of the square stood an iron post to which criminals were wont to be tied, and to this they bound him. Close about him were heaped faggots of wood and dried branches, and within he stood in a motley garment, and the look upon his face was as the coming of the day. All about was a great press of people, merchant and butcher and cloth spinner, and peasant folk from the country round, and on a dais, built high for better seeing, were knights and ladies and nobles of the court, with the king himself and the gentle robber at his side, trimly clad in sober grey and gently smiling. It was a soft day of golden sun, and the sky was blue above the place, and the least wind sighed softly as if for pity as it breathed about the iron stake and played with the yellow locks of the young squire's hair and moved the red folds of the shameful garment that they had placed upon him. Lifting his face, he leaned his cheek against the wind, for it seemed to him a breeze that had played among the beech leaves in the ancient forest by his father's hall, and in taking leave of it he said farewell to his hound and to the woodland paths and to his father's face. Now came a ghostly father, with a torch that flamed backward against the blue day, and in the name of God and Holy Church he bent and kindled the faggots. Then was there quick tumult and rush and stir through the square, for all rushed forward to see and to hear, and little maids were sorely trampled in the press by the great feet of smith and of husbandmen, and women's aprons were badly torn. None cared, for all knew that saving grace was to be won for their own souls if their eyes but caught a glimpse of an heretic that was being burned to death, and when the fire leaped high into the air they gave God thanks. There was a flame in the young martyr's face that was not as the flame that leaped about him, but smoke and fire were speedy with their work, and his head bent over his breast, his body over the chain that bound him, and his soul went free. Folk breathed deeply in relief, saying that an evil doer was dead. Upon the dais the king's broad face showed satisfaction. The bishop lifted his eyes to heaven, thanking God, then let them rest on the grey stone walls of the cathedral, glad that now naught should prevent the walls of God's house from rising. In all the great crowd none other was so devout and so thankful as the gentle robber, and his mild blue eyes were moist with tears as he whispered to the king, "'Tis marvellous the ways by which Providence brings evil-doers to justice. Ever the right prevails." Then all went to the cathedral, knight, squire, and lady in velvet and in silk, the bishop in holy robes of purple and of white, and common folk in blue jean and plain linen, that special service might be held in praise for this great deliverance, and the Te Deum sung. End of The Gentle Robber. End of The Princess Pourquoi by Margaret Pollock Sherwood.